In the dark of the midnight have I oft hid my face, while the storms howl above me, and there's no hiding place. Amidst the crash of the thunder, precious Lord, hear my cry. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. Till the storm passes over, till the thunder sounds no more, till the clouds roll forever from the sky. Hold me fast, let me stand in the hollow of thy hand. Keep me safe till the storm passes by.
We now come to the 1951 delegation session. I know that you have heard quite a bit about this particular delegation session, the things that have happened during it and things that have happened afterwards. We're going to evaluate at this segment only the things that happened during that session. Our next lesson will be dealing with aftermath of that session. The information on this session is taken from the minutes of the 1951 session. On Monday, May 7th, one of the first points of discussion was an appeal of our separated brethren, the ones from Denver. And here's what it says in the minutes. A letter was read to the delegation which was received by Brother Ringelberg from brethren Adamzak, Derschler, Raphael, Kramer, and Charles, who came to the place of the meeting. After reading the letter and consideration was given to it, another letter was read from the USA, Union Conference Committee. The letter was considered on its merits. Appeal was made by the President that the letter be accepted by the Assembly of the Delegates. After some discussion, the following was agreed to: that a committee formed of representatives, including the presidents of the Union Conferences, Holland members, and additional 2 members from Germany, and interpreters be arranged to meet at Utrecht. That Monday, on the 14th of May at 3 p.m., a special meeting to be held for procedure in the meeting with this rebellious group. Brother Stewart was selected to take the report of the meeting. The names of the committee is as follows: Brethren Hartman, Ringelberg, Haven, Baez, Nikolic, Stewart, Stark, Cravioto, Laikowski, Lavrik, Escusa, and Sister Lucier. Brother Ringelberg asked the delegates, and this is now the actual meeting itself. This is the minutes of the actual meeting that they met together with. Brother Ringelberg asked the delegates, this is Adamzak, Derschler, Kramer, Raphael, and Charles, if they were organized or came as individuals, and it was replied that they came not organized. Of course, according to Adamzak's letter, and we show it to you again here, if you may remember this letter from our last lesson, of June 22nd, 1951, it states that they had organized themselves and that Brother Derschler was acting as their president. And they put the dates of up to May 16th. Now, this was May 16th. Now, it is also possible that after this meeting they went out and organized themselves. That is also a possibility. Now, Brother Derschler was questioned. In being questioned as to the opinion of the General Conference in 1948, he stated that he believed that it was corrupt. In the discussion which followed the main talk of Brother Derschler, Brother Adamzak read a statement from Gospel Workers 425, but when he was asked if they acknowledged the present General Conference delegation as with authority, he evaded the question. Brother Adamzak was reminded that he was the president of the Committee of the German Union and chairman of the General Conference in 1948, that he was responsible for what had transpired during the General Conference session. It was pointed out that mistakes may be made and have been made by individuals and will be made continually, but that this does not admit that the General Conference is corrupt and without authority. Brother Derschler compared the work of the General Conference to the Roman Catholic Church and its claim of infallibility. Down further in the questions, Brother Adamczak asked the committee if they believed that Brother Derschler and themselves were rebels. Brother Nikolic made answer this question by relating the fact that the one who pronounced officially that Brethren Derschler and the family of Brother Velp were rebels was Brother Adamczak himself, and that he had signed his signature to this document, and so had all the delegates at that session. Brother Nikolic was invited by the chairman to make a reply to the remarks of Brother Derschler, but immediate opposition was taken by the Derschler delegation. It was stated that such a position was totally unfair and that the accusers should listen to the defense of the remarks of the accusers. To avoid this issue, they all arose and left the meeting with further accusations. Effort was made to persuade them to remain by members of the committee, but they preferred to leave, and basically the meeting ended at that time. Something that was going on between the leaders of the Reform Movement and the separated brethren is a little bit strange here. And here we have an excerpt from the Sabbath Watchman. It was a paper of the separated brethren from the American Union in Denver. And notice the documentation here. Here's what it says. Wednesday morning we went to Utrecht. Brother Derschler was informed that Brother Ringelberg was trying hard to locate him and that he would be intercepted by him on the street corner for a private interview before the meeting. So it was. He was asked in unmistaken terms to team up with them in their fight against Nikolic. This, of course, we could not promise conscientiously, especially since we knew that this would never do away with the general corruption prevailing among the top leaders. Now, that looks a little bit odd. I mean, not a little bit odd, quite a bit odd, that the chairman of the session in 1951 calls this group of people publicly a rebellious group. And he's chairing this meeting, and as a chairman supposed to be a little bit more unbiased, he tries to meet together with them and enlist their efforts to unite together with them to fight against Nikolic. This is very odd. Now, a little bit further down in the same Sabbath Watchman, listen to this. When we finally arrived outside, this is after the meeting, Brother Mueller had been called to the scene, and he took Brother Derschler privately aside, imploring him in a most emotional manner not to leave the place, but help them in their fight against Nikolic. He said, America is no difficulty for us. It is all a settled affair for us. Just go and tell them that you recall all the circular letters, and all is well. What an inconsistent request. It shows itself that we are actually in the clear, even in their own sight. But is also a sad indication of the extent to which these brethren will go in their unrighteous work against one another. Now, why did Brother Ringelberg, who was the temporary chairman of the session, and Brother Mueller, the former president, and then later on the vice president, act in this way against Brother Nikolic with the separated brethren? Why was this? Many of the issues of leadership with the Reform Movement since the 1930s were with Kotzel and Mueller. So, why did they so badly want the separated brethren at any cost to unite with them against Nikolic? What was the issue? What were they planning? What were they attempting to do? In reality, we cannot answer those questions because those questions are regarding motives. So we cannot understand their motives, but we can evaluate the actions that took place between the opening of the General Conference session on May 6th and this meeting on May 16th, as well as what happened afterwards. We can look at those things. And let's take a look. What was it that was the big battleground? What was it that Nikolic was so much in problem with here? Well, let's go back to May 7th. And here again in the minutes, Brother Lausevic questioned the delegates of the merits of Brother Kistner for the German Union. Brother Kistner explained his case, and he admitted that he was sorry for his sin which he had made. He explained that he was ready to resign from his office at that time, but the church and the conferences to which he belonged encouraged him to take further responsibilities until today. He left the case to be decided by the delegates. That's interesting. Here is a case of Brother Kistner. What's going on here? May 8th, Tuesday, May 8th. Practically the whole of the session was occupied with a discussion on the matter of Brother Kistner and his delegation, which is in question. Now, during that meeting, Brother Kistner returned to the assembly and asked that he be relieved from all responsibility. May 9th. A letter was read from Brother Kistner stating that he resigned from further responsibilities on the General Conference and as a delegate from the German Union in view of the circumstances. Now, Brother Nikolic spoke on the matter of principle and that we cannot be inconsistent with our teachings. Discussion continued on the question of workers who have fallen in open sin. In the afternoon meeting, Brother Stewart spoke on the question of the committee of the conference and recommended a change. Brother Kotzel, after some remarks, stated that he desired to be relieved of his office. And then the next minute, Brother Mueller also made a statement that he too desired to be relieved of his office on the committee. Brother Mueller apologized for his part in not informing the responsible brethren about the case of Brother Kistner. Brother Luft explained how the position of the German Union was made as a result of the position taken by Brother Adamczak and Brother Muscat on the matter of Brother Kistner's case. Later, Brother Mueller moved that Brother Kistner be asked to return to the assembly to take part in the discussion in an advisory capacity. And this was carried. Now, the case of Brother Kistner had to do with regard to the violation of the 7th commandment. His case was actually brought to the open by Brother Adamczak. He wrote a letter dated April 5, 1950. And here you can see the original, and of course we have a translated version of it. And here's what he wrote. In 1947, this is going back before the previous delegation session. Remember, the first delegation session after the World War was 1948. In 1947, Brother Mueller was informed of Brother Kistner's matrimony with all accuracy by Brother H. Brother Kotzel, too, was informed at The Hague by Brother Kistner himself of his matrimonial condition. It should be admitted that these two brethren, who are at the head of the work, would act in harmony with the law and the testimonies and guard against introducing an adulterer in the General Conference. A big mistake. So here, at this time, Brother Adamczak writes a letter and states that there is an adulterer in the General Conference. Now, of course, quite a few of the other brethren did not know about it. Most of the brethren of the General Conference Executive Committee did not know about it. They first heard it in this particular letter. He goes on, when in former years a worker in the cause of God approached his sister with too much intimacy, he was called to account and deposed from his office. And that was right. Brother Kistner, however, is still rewarded for his sin, as he is promoted to a higher office. In addition to this, the direction of the missionary school at Spiele is also entrusted to him. Just fancy, brethren, an adulterer in the General Conference. Can that be the voice of God? So here this Brother Kistner was involved in an adulterous relationship, and Brother Mueller, who was president of the General Conference, knew about it. And then in 1948, at the General Conference session, Brother Kotzel knew about it. And then, as these brethren knew about it, this individual was not only tolerated, but he became a General Conference Executive Committee member. And according to this letter, also became the director of the missionary school in Spiele. In 1951, in August, after the delegation session, after the split, Angel Cravioto, who is the son-in-law of Brother Kotzel, he addressed some of these issues. And the original here is in Spanish. Translation says, they accuse us, saying, we have supported adulterers, men guilty of violation of the 7th commandment. Down further, our leaders have never condoned the things for which they are now being blamed. Further down, it is true that somebody fell in sin, but his repentance was deep as that of David. Read Psalm 51. This brother came before the church weeping and asked to be forgiven of God and of men. So, what could we do to him? Stone him? The Bible does not teach that. The brethren forgave him, and now at the General Conference, he laid down his office and everything was settled. Down further, it happened 6 years ago, and Brother Kotzel knew it only 3 years later. Therefore, why should he be blamed? if this is 6 years earlier than 1951, that means that it was only 3 years afterwards that he became a General Conference Executive Committee member. Is that something that we allow? The problem was in knowing that a disqualified person was allowed to be in an office and the committee wasn't informed. That's where the problem was. I can understand forgiveness. Everyone commits various kinds of sins. But is this sin, adultery, the same as just any other sin? We'll come back to that in a minute. Another case was brought, that of Brother Cortman from Canada. His case was that of a minister. He is being a minister. He proposed marriage to a woman who was already divorced. And several days were taken in all that discussion. This introduction of issues that affected morality or that did not belong to the session caused a serious division among the delegates. I have a question. Why do we make such an issue about this issue of morality? Is it that important in a person's life? Aren't all sins the same? Do we consider all sins on an equal basis? Do we take the violation of the seventh commandment as more severe than any other sin? It is true that any sin will keep us out of the kingdom of heaven. One small sin will keep us out. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden ate the forbidden fruit. But it is also true that there are different degrees of sin. Steps to Christ, page 30. God does not regard all sins as of equal magnitude. There are degrees of guilt in His estimation as well as that of man. But however trifling this or that wrong may seem in the eyes of men, no sin is small in the sight of God. Now, sins dealing with morality are different than any other sins. 1 Corinthians 6, 16 to 18. What? Know ye not that he which is joined to an harlot is one body? For two saith he shall be one. But he that is joined unto the Lord is one spirit. Flee fornication. Now listen to this. Every sin that a man doeth is without the body. But he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. That means that this sin is different than any other sin. Now, how should we deal with issues related to the seventh commandment, especially in the ministry? Is there a way to deal with it? Testimonies of Ministers 4:27, 4:28. Cleanse the camp of this moral corruption if it takes the highest men in the highest position. Now, what are we told here? Cleanse the camp even if it takes the men in the highest positions. Are we willing to take this to what it says? When God says cleanse the camp, are we prepared to cleanse the camp? God will not be trifled with. Fornication is in our ranks. I know it, for it has been shown to me to be strengthening and extending its pollutions. There is much we will never know, but that which is revealed makes the church responsible and guilty unless they show a determined effort to eradicate the evil. Cleanse the camp, for there is an accursed thing in it. You remember when Achan had an accursed thing, what happened? All of Israel suffered the consequences. So now here the entire church is responsible for that guilt unless it takes some action. If a minister violates the seventh commandment, can we entrust souls to his care? Testimonies of Ministers 4:28. I have no real ground of hope for those who have stood as shepherds to the flock and have for years been borne with by the merciful God, following them with reproof and with warnings, with entreaties, but who have hid their evil ways and continued in them, thus defying the laws of the God of heaven by practicing fornication. We may leave them to work out their own salvation with fear and trembling, after all has been done to reform them, but in no case entrust to them the guardianship of souls. What? In no case entrust to them the guardianship of souls. How do we deal with people that violate the seventh commandment? In the book Testimonies on Sexual Behavior, 248. It has had an awful corrupting influence upon the young. They see how lightly the sin of breaking the seventh commandment is regarded. And the one who commits this horrid sin thinks that all he has to do is confess that he was wrong and is sorry. And he is then to have all the privileges of the house of God and be held in the embrace or fellowship of the church. Now here's what people think. Okay, we committed the sin against the seventh commandment, and all we have to do is say, I am sorry, and everything should be normal. Is that how we do it? How is this type of attitude affected in God's people? Continuing on. They have thought it was not so great a sin, but have lightly esteemed the breaking of the seventh commandment. This has been sufficient to remove the ark of God from the camp, if there were no other sins to cause the ark to be taken away and weaken Israel. So if there were no other sins, this sin alone would be cause enough to remove the ark from God's people. Thus, the commission of the seventh commandment requires suspension from the church. You know, we read many statements about those who are in persistent open sin. But what about with the seventh commandment? Again, Testimonies on Sexual Behavior, page 248 and 249. Those who break the seventh commandment should be suspended from the church and not have its fellowship nor the privileges of the house of God. What does it say here? When an individual violates the seventh commandment, what does it say? They should be suspended from the church and not have its fellowship nor the privileges of the house of God. Said the angel, this is not a sin of ignorance. It is a knowing sin and will receive the awful visitation of God, whether he who commits it be old or young. Now, are we to take a stronger stand on the issue of morality today than at any other time in Earth's history? Again, Testimonies on Sexual Behavior, 249. Never was this sin regarded by God as being so exceeding sinful as at the present time. When? At the present time, there has never been a time in this history of this world when this sin had been considered so exceeding sinful. Why? Because God is purifying unto himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. It is at the very time when God is purifying this people unto himself that unsanctified individuals step in among us. We claim to be the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement. We claim to have a higher standard in this world. And as we claim a higher standard, are we to lower the seventh commandment in the dust? God is purifying unto himself a purified people. And this issue of the seventh commandment needs to be looked at in its proper perspective. It goes on. Notwithstanding the straight truths they have heard, the terrors of the word of God set before them, and all the blazing truth for these last days calculated to arouse Israel, they sin with a high hand, give way to all the loose passions of the carnal heart, gratify their animal propensities, disgrace the cause of God, and then confess that they have sinned and they are sorry. Is this how it is to work? After all that, and then confess and say, oh, I'm sorry. And then what? And the church receives them and says amen to their prayers and their exhortations. Is that how it goes? And yet, listen to this. And the church receives them and says amen to their prayers and exhortations, which are a stink in the nostrils of God and causes wrath to come upon the camp. That's what God says. Now, if God says it is a stink in his nostrils, are we just to sit there and accept someone who says, I am sorry, and then give him the responsibility of training our young people at the missionary school? And then give him a responsibility on the General Conference Executive Committee? I'm sorry. There's something wrong with our understanding of morality. It goes on. He will not dwell in their assemblies. Those who move on thus heedlessly, plastering over these sins, will be left to their own ways and to be filled with their own doings. God is not going to be in the assemblies of those who treat this sin so lightly. Now, if God considers these grievous sins among church members, how does he look upon those who hold leadership positions? Patriarchs and Prophets, 420. God had forgiven the people greater transgressions, but he could not deal with sin in the leaders as in those who were led. He had honored Moses above every other man upon the earth. He had revealed to him his glory, and through him he had communicated his statutes to Israel. The fact that Moses had enjoyed so great light and knowledge made his sin more grievous. Past faithfulness will not atone for one wrong act. The greater the light and privileges granted to man, the greater is his responsibility, the more aggravated his failure, and the heavier his punishment. I think that when I read these statements, that ministers are treated more severely for any sin that they commit as opposed to that of any other member. A common member would be suspended from church. And yet a minister, instead of that, given higher responsibilities? No, definitely not. This is why the 1951 delegation session was not just on organizational issues. It's true, there are organizational issues that are involved. But this particular issue brought it to a crisis. And we cannot close our eyes to it. Now, we're not going to spend any more time on this particular moment on some of these other issues, organizational issues, financial issues at the conference, irregularities at the delegation. I'm not going to go through all that right now. But just reading some of these statements really touches each one of us that we have a high calling before God. After all these days of going on and defending Brother Kistner, then introducing Brother Cortman on similar issues of morality, on May 20th, 1951, 11 delegates had enough, and they walked out of the meeting in protest in the way the session had run. Since the meetings began on May 6th, this is nearly 15 days of holding back the business. Few delegates wrote out a protest and requested to read it. At first, it was voted to read it, but the chairman would not allow that to be read. Finally, they walked out. And here were the 9 reasons that they gave for they could not tolerate the session any longer. I'll only summarize them here. You can take a look at some of them, but basically here's the decisions. Number 1, the first issue is regarding representation as announced by Brother Kotzel in his circular letter in preparation for the conference. Various fields and unions were worked in such a way that more representatives would come from them, while others who had the right to more delegates were actually lessened. Number 2, after protests were made, the manner of the first circular letter, Brother Kotzel sent another circular letter limiting the rights of other unions to their rightful delegates. Number 3, delegates at large were required to be elected by their unions rather than to come as delegates at large, especially with Brazil and the United States. 4, during the years 1948 to 1951, no committee meetings were held by the General Conference to settle issues in which Brother Kotzel was specifically involved. Number 5, a preparatory committee meeting was scheduled April 29th till May 5th. But even that was limited to only 1.5 days, and instead of dealing with some of the issues, only some financial issues were dealt with. Number 6, of the hundreds of believers in South America Conference North, 3 members of the Kotzel family were appointed delegates to the General Conference. There was Brother Kotzel, there was his wife was appointed a delegate, and also his son-in-law, Brother Cravioto, to a country he did not even visit. Number 7, Brother Kistner's role as a delegate was challenged. And here's what they wrote. For 5 days, Brother Kistner's case was discussed, all the while being defended by Brother Kotzel, Mueller, Luft, Korpman, and Ringelberg. At last, Brother Kistner resigned as a delegate and was relieved from the position of minister and teacher of the school. But this was after 5 days discussing the case, when a man had admitted to it. 8, 4 days were spent in discussion about the financial report given by Brother Kotzel. Instead of submitting the authority of the conference to the delegation, Brother Kotzel continued to dominate the meeting. Number 9, after 9 days, the reports of the unions finally began. On the 12th day of discussion, the case of Brother Kortman was introduced. Although objections were constantly made to the temporary chairman, Brother Ringelberg, to continue with the order of the conference, a further 3 days were spent in this case. Brother Kotzel and Mueller stubbornly persisted in giving him support, even though he confessed to the points that were brought before the conference. When a minister is sent to a mission field at the expense of the movement and is only able to report an admission that he had proposed marriage to a divorced woman, in whose home he had lived alone for 2 years. Knowing that she was divorced, we certainly cannot keep silent. We cannot stand for such an evil appearance among our believers anywhere, and never in workers and the members of the General Conference Committee or delegation. By walking out in protest, these 11 delegates did not leave the Reform movement, nor did they cease to be delegates. They did not cease representing the people that sent them. In 1888, Sister White wrote something. The 1888 materials, page 181, she says, "I have pledged myself by a solemn vow to God that wherever this spirit of contempt and unkindness and want of love should exist, I would lay it out in clear lines before my brethren, show them the sinfulness of their course, and with decided testimony turn the current if possible. If I could not succeed, then I would withdraw myself from the meetings, for I am afraid to be in such gatherings lest I shall be leavened with the prevailing spirit." Her leaving a meeting was not a signal of leaving the church, nor was she abandoning her responsibilities. The remaining 12 delegates had no quorum, and thus the meeting should have come to an end until there was reconciliation. 2 delegates arrived a little bit later, so they had 14 eventually. Various correspondence went between the 2 groups until the 14 delegates reorganized the General Conference on May 23, 1951. Let's just look at the reorganization for a moment. According to the declaration dated May 24th, 1951, the group led by Carlos Kotzel organized themselves on May 23rd. And here is some of the documentation. Here's what it says. On this occasion, in a special selection meeting convening May 23rd at Utrecht, Holland, the following officers were chosen, also the General Conference Committee, which will have in hand the direction of the General Conference. The officers listed there was Carlos Kotzel as President, A. Ringelberg Secretary, Treasurer Rosa Kotzel, Committee Carlos Kotzel, A. Ringelberg, E. Stark, Albert Mueller, and Angel Cravioto. These are officers, if you notice, look at the letterhead and everything, these were officers of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement General Conference, according to that letterhead. Furthermore, they write there, we request to register the above-mentioned officers and the new leading committee of the General Conference. In virtue of this, the persons registered in May 1949 have no right to act in office, neither execute business enterprise for and in the name of our society, valid from May 23, 1951. This is valid especially for the former secretary, D. Nikolic Sacramento, who does not belong any longer to our movement. In the same declaration it says, we request that you also cancel paragraph 2 of section 2.2, last sentence on page 2 and 3. Delegates who cannot be present at the conference are entitled to entrust their vote to some of those present to represent them in our bylaws' leading principles. So they're requesting that this section here about the proxy vote be canceled because they don't agree with it. It says, then also in the statutes of incorporation, articles of incorporation for nonprofit corporation, the last part of the articles should be canceled, which runs, we believe, etc. This request because D. Nikolic, our former provisionary secretary, has added those parts of paragraphs to the bylaws, leading principles, as also to the statutes of incorporation because this was done without permission of the leading committee. Down further, the new selection and the canceling of the before-mentioned parts of the paragraph were decided to be executed by the delegates from several countries in the world together in an organizatorial meeting. I'll come back to that in a moment. The other group did not organize themselves until the group led by Brother Kotzel had already done so. They were organized according to the minutes on Thursday, May 24th, 1951, the next day, after the others had already organized themselves. They had the nominating committee, and then they elected the officers as follows. D. Nikolic was president, A. Lausevic vice president, C.T. Stewart secretary, L. Ehrlich treasurer, and the executive committee was D. Nikolic, A. Lausevic, C.T. Stewart, J. Hartman, and E. Laikowski. The delegation of the 2 groups combined, and here's what we need to consider for a moment. When the act about proxy vote is removed, stop and consider this. The delegation of the 2 groups combined represented 4,378 members. That's who they represented. Brethren Kotzel and Mueller refused to recognize the letters of representation from the other unions. The other unions, or another 28 delegates, 18 were specifically given letters to Brother Nikolic to represent them, were 6,398 members. Now, if that provision is removed of proxy vote, then the entire delegation was illegal. For that matter, due to restrictions in oppressive countries, the first legal delegation session after World War II would have been the one our church held in the year 1991. It is the first time the delegates from the Eastern European countries were able to attend. Now stop and think a little bit more. If we look at the counting here, only 12 delegates supported Brother Kotzel and Mueller. They represented 2,021 members of the church, or about 17 to 19% of the total church membership. Is 17 to 19% sufficient to form the organization of a general conference? The delegates were the group that issued the protest, represented 2,250 members, or 19 to 21% of the church membership. If you add the ones requesting representation, with Brother Nikolic, he had 18 other letters that referred to him as their proxy vote. That would add to them another 6,398. Total of 8,648 members, or 72 to 81% of the total church membership. The total membership at the time in 1951 was either 10,669 according to the report, or according to some of the other records, they're about 12,000 members. If we do not accept representation by proxy, then only 40% of the church was represented. Insufficient to hold a delegation. Is that a representation of the church? If anything else, that session was not a legal session. We have to either accept a proxy vote or call another session representing the majority of the church. And in reality, with such a division, another session should have been called. And we'll talk about that in our next segment here. At the end of May 1951, there were two groups of leaders claiming to be the rightfully elected leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement. There was also that third group who claimed to be the International Committee with Brother Derschler as president. We will evaluate the actions of each of these three groups following the 1951 session in our next lesson. And it's important for us to understand a couple of things before we go on. Number one, in this session, 1951, the major issue was dealing with the seventh commandment and how we are to treat people who fall into the seventh commandment, especially if they are in leadership roles. And that's an important issue. Keep in mind those statements that we looked at from the Bible and from the Spirit of prophecy.
I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather be His than have riches untold. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or lands. I'd rather be led by His nail-pierced hand than to be the king of a vast domain, or be held in sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. He's fairer than lilies honey from out the comb. He's all that my hungering spirit needs. Oh, I'd rather have Jesus and let him lead than to be the king of a vast domain, or be held in sin's red sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords.